This is the Mexican-American Experience, a program exploring Chicano history and culture. This week, we'll take a look at the origins of Pachuquismo and the so-called Zoot Suit Race Riots. In the late 1930s and the early 1940s, if a boy wished to be known as a gangster, two roads were open to him. He could commit a crime and be convicted, or he could, with much less trouble, become a member of a Pachuco gang. Of course, this was mainly limited to a particular group, the Mexican Americans. If a boy was born of Mexican parents who were financially unable to move out of a specific slum area, he could be a gangster from birth without even having to commit a crime. In Los Angeles, the old saying that boys will be boys was revised to read, boys, if Mexicans, will be gangsters. American boys traditionally, quote, hang out with the gang, whether it be the gang they go to school with, or those who live in the same neighborhood, or those who have the same hobbies. But a gang of Chicano boys in Los Angeles was held together by a set of associations which often outweighed all other influences. These associations included being blatantly discriminated against once they left their own district, learning in the schools that they were at the bottom of the social ladder, and having his attitude about home poisoned by all the attitudes he learned at school. This left them with only one place to find security and status, the gangs, made up of boys who lived in the same neighborhood and who were going through the same distressing process at precisely the same time. The Pachuco gangs were a much more tightly knit group because they suffered discrimination together, and a commonly shared hostility makes for strong cohesiveness. Carey McWilliam explains, knowing that both as individuals and as a group they were not welcome in many parts of the city, they created their own world and tried to make it as self-sufficient as possible. It should be noted, however, that Mexican boys have never willingly accepted those inferior accommodations and the inferior status they connote. Pachuquismo followed a decade of important social change for Chicanos because during the Depression thousands of Mexican Americans were repatriated, and those remaining had to adjust to a new mode of existence. Migratory families had to become more stabilized in order to obtain relief, and this implied more regular schooling and an involvement in urban life, thus causing an impingement of the larger Anglo-American community. Being strangers to an urban environment, as Carey McWilliam points out, the first generation had tended to respect the boundaries of the Mexican communities. But the second generation was lured far beyond these boundaries, and it was this generation of Mexicans, the Pachuco generation, that first came to the general notice and attention of the Anglo-American population. Thus, along with the growth of the gangs, a new stereotype developed of Chicanos as Pachuco gangsters, or Zoot Suiters. Many theories have been expounded as to the origin of the word Pachuco, but the Pachuco stereotype was born in Los Angeles. Their skin was darker, they were bilingual, speaking both Spanish and English with an accent, and they also had a uniform, the Zoot Suit, which served to make them conspicuous. But the Chicanos never called them Zoot Suits, preferring to speak of them as drapes. Appearing first in the late 30s and early 40s, the drapes resembled the Zoot Suits worn by blacks in Harlem, although members could point out differences in detail and design. They were very functional in design and were originally worn by boys who engaged in a specific type of activity, namely a certain style of dancing. The trouser cuffs were tight around the ankles so as not to catch on the boys' heels as they moved their feet quickly. The coat's shoulders were wide, giving plenty of room for strenuous arm movement, and the shoes were heavy, serving to anchor the boy to the dance floor as he spun his partner around. At first, the boys wore the suits simply for their functional aspect, but as time went on, they were worn as a badge of defiance against the larger society, and at the same time as a symbol of belonging to an inner group. McWilliam says that it was at once a sign of rebellion and a mark of belonging. It carried prestige. Many of the boys saved for months to buy their drapes, with the length of the coat and the width of the shoulders becoming marks of prestige. But it's important to note that the Zoot Suit was not universal among Mexican-American boys. Some never adopted it, while others never adopted it completely. The newspapers promptly hit upon the Zoot Suit as a badge of crime. But according to McWilliams, one Zoot-suited boy told him, "If I were a gangster, would I wear a Zoot Suit so that everyone would know I was a gangster? No. I'd maybe dress like a priest or like everyone else, but not in a Zoot Suit." On Thursday evening, June 3rd, 1943, a group of 11 sailors on leave from their station were walking on North Main Street in the center of one of Los Angeles's worst slum areas. The surrounding neighborhood was predominantly Mexican-American. This area was well away from the popular sections of town, and few servicemen had been this far north on Main Street. According to the sailors, they were walking down the street when they were jumped by a gang of Chicano boys. The sailors were reportedly outnumbered 3-1, and one was seriously hurt, and the others suffered minor cuts and bruises. They reported the incident to the police, who, instead of attempting to find and arrest the gang, waited until they were off duty to clean up the gang that had attacked the sailors. The 14 policemen, who under the command of a detective lieutenant called themselves the Vengeance Squad, went to the scene of the attack, but surprisingly couldn't find anybody to arrest. McWilliam says that in itself, this curious inability to find anyone to arrest, so strikingly at variance with what usually happened on raids of this sort, raises an inference that a larger strategy was involved. For the raid accomplished nothing except to whip up the anger of the community against the Mexican population, which may perhaps have been the reason for the raid. Thus began the so-called Zoot Suit Race Riots in Los Angeles. On the following night, about 200 sailors from the Naval Armory in Chavez Ravine hired a fleet of 20 taxicabs, went down into the center of Los Angeles, and headed towards the east side, where most of the Mexican Americans lived. They drove down the streets systematically, stopping and beating up every Mexican American boy who was wearing a Zoot Suit. Fortunately, only 4 boys were beaten up. 2 were 17 years old, one was 19, and the other was 23 years old. McWilliam states that at one point the police did happen to cross the trail of the caravan, and the officers were apparently somewhat embarrassed over the meeting, for only 9 of the sailors were taken into custody, and the rest were permitted to continue on their merry way. Then the sailors returned to the armory, where they were met by police and shore patrol. Only 17 of them were arrested. The rest were sent home, and the petty officer who led the expedition told the police, "We're out to do what the police have failed to do. We're going to clean up this situation." And he promised to bring the Marines along the next night. The next day, the Los Angeles press pushed the war news from the front pages with headlines such as "Wild Night in L.A., Sailor-Zooter Clash," and "Sailor Task Force Hits L.A. Zooters." None of the stories, however, reported any resistance by Mexican Americans. On the next night, June 5th, the sailors returned, joined by soldiers and Marines. They paraded through downtown Los Angeles, threatening every boy wearing a Zoot Suit. 27 Chicano boys who were gathered at a street corner were arrested and jailed on suspicion of various offenses. But the police, shore patrol, and military police made almost no effort to hinder the mob of several hundred servicemen roaming through the downtown section, threatening every Chicano in sight. At the same time, in various parts of the city, squads of servicemen invaded bars and beat up anyone wearing their drapes and tearing off their clothes afterwards. All this warranted such measures as an out-of-bounds order for the area, but all that was done was the police called up some additional reserves and announced that any Mexicans involved in the riots would be promptly arrested. What the police failed to notice was that there had been no counterattacks by Mexican Americans so far. On the night of June 6th, the police decided to just follow the sailors at a convenient pace and mop up the injured victims of the mob. McWilliams describes the rest of the night. Carefully following the sailors, the police arrested 11 boys who had been beaten up on Carmelita Street. 6 more victims were arrested a few blocks farther on, 7 at Ford Boulevard, 6 at Gifford Street, and so on, straight through the Mexican East Side settlements. By morning, some 44 Mexican boys, all severely beaten, were under arrest. The really serious rioting was now about to take place on June 7th and 8th. The press ensured this by warning that the Zoot Suiters planned mass retaliations. The headlines read, "Zooters planning to attack more servicemen." The subhead continued, "Would jab broken bottlenecks in the faces of their victims, beating sailors' brains out with hammers also on program." Having been given 12 hours' notice by the press, thousands of soldiers, sailors, and civilians turned out that evening and proceeded to beat up every Zoot Suiter they could find. They stopped streetcars and searched theaters. If they found a Zoot Suiter, they would strip him and then beat him up. They paraded down Main Street until they reached the edge of the Black District. But learning what the blacks had in store for them, they turned back and marched through the Mexican East Side again. Throughout the night, scores of Mexican-American mothers were trying to locate their youngsters, and boys were pleading at police stations to be arrested for anything so they wouldn't get beat up. From affidavits prepared at the time, it turns out that less than half of the victims, some as young as 12 and 13, were actually wearing zoot suits. At midnight on June 7th, the military authorities decided that the local police were completely unable or unwilling to handle the situation. They declared the entire downtown area of Los Angeles out of bounds for military personnel. This immediately slowed down the pace of the rioting. On June 8th, the city officials began to issue statements. The district attorney, Fred N. Hauser, thought that the situation was getting entirely out of hand, while the mayor, Fletcher Bowen, replied that sooner or later it would blow over. The chief of police took account of the Mexicans in jail and cheerfully proclaimed that the situation had now been cleared up. But it didn't blow over. It spread to the suburbs, where the rioting continued for 2 more days. When it finally stopped, the Eagle Rock Advertiser editorialized that it is too bad the servicemen were called off before they were able to complete the job. Most of the citizens of the city have been delighted with what has been going on. The district attorney of Ventura County issued a statement to the effect that zoot suits were an open indication of subversive characters. Apparently, this was also the opinion of the Los Angeles City Council, because they adopted a resolution making the wearing of zoot suits a misdemeanor. But this baiting continued, and on June 11th, hundreds of handbills were distributed to students and posted on bulletin boards in a high school attended by many blacks and Mexican Americans, which read, "Big sale, second-hand zoot suits, slightly damaged. Apply at nearest U.S. Naval Station. While they last, we have all sizes." This pretty well sums up the general opinion of the public. The press continued its techniques of egging on the mobs by using headlines such as "Zoot Suiters Learn Lesson and Fight with Servicemen," and editorializing that the riots were having a cleansing effect. And the riots and beatings continued on a progressively smaller scale for a long time. Now, a nearly forgotten moment in history, but a part of a long series of systematic injustices suffered by Mexican Americans. You have been listening to the Mexican American Experience. This program is made possible in part by a grant from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. Research material obtained from the book North from Mexico by Carey McWilliam. The Mexican American Experience is produced at KUT-FM by Alejandro Saenz, in association with the Center for Mexican American Studies, and distributed by Communication Center, all at the University of Texas at Austin. This is Richard Goodman, and this is the Longhorn Radio Network.